Welcome everybody. It is September, time for cooler temperatures and beautiful autumn colors. I hope you all are enjoying that first hint of the fall air, and or here in Alaska, our trees are vibrant yellows and oranges already. It's been lovely so far. So welcome to the National Weather Association's webinar series. My name is Becca Mazer and I will be your host for today's webinar. Few logistics before we get started. Everyone will be on mute for most of the talk except for near the end when you will be able to share some stories. Jamie will ask for your quote unquote war stories, and then I will go ahead and unmute everybody after that. But throughout the webinar, you can ask questions by either using the question GUI on the GoToWebinar GUI or in the chat. I will then read the questions at the end of the presentation, and then they will, of course, give answers to those questions. This webinar is being recorded for later viewing. So I am pleased to introduce our speakers today, Jamie Boettcher from OU Zero and Evan Bentley from the NWS Storm Prediction Center. And their title of their talk today is WSR 88D Sidelobe Contamination, from a conceptual model to diagnostic strategies for improving National Weather Service warning performance. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. For those who may not know, I am retired National Weather Service, so I still think of myself as National Weather Service. And thank you for the introduction. Evan and I have had quite a journey on this work, and we were excited to show it to you. Before I go any further, though, I need to give everyone a reminder about the basic structure of a radar beam. We have a main lobe, and this is just a cartoon. This is not for any particular radar, but there's always a main lobe, and then there are multiple side lobes. So I'll be going into more detail about these two components, but I wanted to give you a heads up about the main lobe and side lobe parts of a radar. So, Evan, this is you.
All right, I will take it away. So, similar to what Becca had said, our trees are also starting to change here in Norman, but ours are because of drought stress, not because it's actually turning to fall. So we'll get to look forward to straight to brown for our fall season, most likely, because we're in the middle of a drought. So we're definitely jealous of your beautiful color that you've got going on up there, Becca, and the cooler temperatures for sure, as we get back up into the mid-90s this week. But anyway, on to the task at hand. So, looking back at some of the previous work, so Jamie was kind of crucial in this part. She had kind of gone back and she kind of recognized the problem, and I kind of came in just as kind of adding some operational expertise and kind of someone who's looked at a lot of events and seen a lot of these and kind of added that component to it. So we kind of melded and meshed very well. So looking back through the literature, that was kind of one of the first things we did from a lit review perspective, and realized like there really hadn't been much of anything actually published on this topic. Something we were all taught in school about side lobes and how they can manifest, but a little more specifics about it really wasn't there. And so when we look back through Steve Piltz and Don Burgess back in 2009, they had I think it was a conference preprint there where they were talking about side lobe contamination and how it impacted NWS warnings. But that was kind of the only thing that had been discussed until in 2017. The Thompson paper, it discussed, when they were talking about the VROT calculations, it discussed how many issues they ran into when they were looking at the VROT calculations. There were all types of side lobe things like that, and so it was a challenge for them to try and get an accurate VROT calculation. And then here more recently, Nye et al. In 2020, they talked about the term elevation side lobe contamination, and talked about how it often manifests itself as junk in the inflow. You can see that there in the image on the right. This is the type of things that a lot of times operational forecasters will filter out themselves. You've seen this plenty of times and you're like, yeah, that's just junk in the inflow. But there's a little more reasoning behind why it's there, and that's part of what we're going to get into today. And then in the work that Rich and I did in 2021, and then built on the support of Justin Gibbs at WDTD and Steve Nelson in Atlanta, and Randy Bowers, who was here in Norman and is now at the Indy office doing great things. But when we looked through that, we noted whether or not there was side lobe contamination present, and that was really an interesting data set for Jamie and I to work with as we moved on later. And it was interesting to note that you could actually see that there was a decreased warning performance when there was sidelobe contamination present. And also there was a sweet spot. And so on this graph that's down here in the bottom right, I think it comes up bigger, you can actually see that there's basically a peak. 32% of all tornado warnings had a presence of sidelobe contamination when you get to the 5,000 to 6,000 foot radar bin. But really, it's very common anywhere from that 3,000 to 8,000 foot range or so, which kind of makes sense. That's kind of the height where your beam is going to be just below the echo overhang and where you're most likely to hit some sidelobe contamination. But it was interesting to see just how high those numbers were. We're talking 32% when you're talking in that 5,000 to 6,000 foot radar bin. And then when you look at the verification of it, this is what was very interesting. When there was contaminated velocity data present, the false alarm rate for tornado warnings was 0.79 versus 0.66 when there was no contaminated velocity. And just to put that in perspective, yeah, that only sounds like 13% difference, but that's the difference in 1 in 3 versus 1 in 5 tornado warnings verifying. And so it is a very significant difference, even though it might only look like 13% there. The other interesting thing is when you look at storm mode, supercell really jumps out. And so supercell is the dominant mode that you're going to get this. Kind of makes sense. That's how you get your echo overhang and a lot of things that you need to have sidelobe contamination be a significant issue. But it was kind of interesting to see the data support that with 29% of supercells having sidelobe contamination present. And we estimate 90% or so of that is probably elevation sidelobe contamination, and that's what we'll spend a good majority of the time talking about today. Here's kind of an example from that paper in 2021 that kind of shows an example of what we see here. This might be the type of imposter circulation that might confuse a radar operator. You look at it, you see really strong inbounds, really strong outbounds, and if you were to take those verbatim, you've got 86 knot inbounds and 42 knot outbounds, and you're looking at 60 knot VROT. And wow, this is a really strong supercell. Well, no doubt it's a strong supercell, but if you're looking for an actual tornado, you should be looking back in that appendage, back in the hook echo, as it's commonly referred to. That's where your tornado is going to be. And so you can see the black circle there. When you actually just look at the velocity data within that hook, it's actually a very broad and weak circulation, very different than what you're looking at if you use that. So where's all this velocity coming from out there in the inflow? What's going on? Why does that exist there? Well, that's what we wanted to get into today. That's sidelobe contamination. And why it is those values, we'll get to that later. But it is an interesting thing to note for kind of why it's there and the issues that it causes. So we looked at basically a lot of those tornado warning supercells that we had in the 2021 database and looked at all the supercells. I shouldn't say all of them, but we looked at a large subset of them with velocity contamination and kind of picked out some of the common themes that we saw, et cetera. And just to kind of see how elevation sidelobe contamination appears in the data, and the answer was in a ton of different ways. It's not simple. There's a bunch of different ways to see it, but we really kind of broke it down to kind of some things to look for. And then also we really wanted to say, all right, how do you recognize these imposter circulations? Those are the biggest problems. Those are the ones that make you say, all right, I got to get a warning out. This is a strong rotating storm. We wanted to help people use diagnostic tools to say, wait a minute, can I actually trust this data? So just kind of going back to the basics, this image here is what you would typically be looking for a tornadic circulation. You can see there's a nice gradient between the strongest winds as you move inward. There's a nice consistent gradual uptick in the strength of the winds as you get closer to the center. There's actually even a little bit of cyclonic curvature as you look at the circulation. There's a lot of things that to like there. There's obviously some funky velocity data right there in the very middle. That looks like there's a debris ball there, so there's probably some things associated with that as well that are causing some issues. But the other thing to note is that a lot of times people would think, oh, what's the gate to gate circulation on a storm, or oh, is it 40 knots gate to gate? I remember even early in my career back in the 2011, 2012, you're talking about, all right, what is it gate to gate? And it's important to know that that's not always the most important thing for multiple reasons. Sometimes when you're really close to the radar, the actual radius of the circulation is actually broader than the beam itself, and so you might actually need to go a couple out to get the max part of the circulation. Other times, when it's further away, you might actually be looking at the mesocyclone, and so it might actually be a broader circulation that's a proxy for your tornadic circulation. So it might be 3-4 miles wide. And then you also would need to look at the broader circulation. So it doesn't always matter whether or not it's gate to gate. It's really just kind of looking at the peak velocities, and kind of along the lines of like what we did in our 2021 paper and what Rich and Brian had first set out in their series of papers related to VROT. Within 5 nautical miles is really the important thing. Any broader than that, and it's probably too broad to really be concerning. When you're getting that broad, it's just a totally different beast. It's really looking at anything 5 miles or less, and really most of the time 3 miles or less is what you're looking at for things that could be true tornadic circulations. So that's just kind of a refresher there on what a typical velocity signature might look like.
Okay, Evan was way too modest. In this partnership, Evan has been the quantitative data guy, and I have been the qualitative radar person. So it's been a very good match. All right, Azimuthal sidelobe contamination. Let's start with that. The blue arrows are pointing towards an example here, and look at this storm core. This is a very intense hail core. You've got a dramatically large reflectivity gradient over a very short, just a few degrees in azimuth. So this is going to cause azimuthal sidelobe contamination. You could see the contamination and the gradient itself on the same image. We typically have a 3-body scatter spike with these kinds of signatures because of the radar orientation. And I told you we were going to talk about the main lobe versus the side lobes. In this particular case, the tip of this azimuthal contamination is about 20 degrees away from this storm core. So when the main lobe is way out here, we've got side lobes that are 20 degrees away that are still striking this core and returning power that's showing up in the clear air. That's why I want you to forget about this first side lobe business. Okay, here's a closer look at what this graphic is and what it means. This is the only measured antenna pattern for the 88D fleet. This is the research radar here at the Severe Storms Lab. And here is the main lobe, and you've got the first side lobe, and it is labeled. And it's about, what matters here is that it's 58 dB down, which is, 6 orders of magnitude. So that's a lot. But I don't want you to think about that number. I want you to think about the area under the curve of all of this side lobe that you see, which actually extends plus or minus 180 degrees. This is a 2-dimensional slice of the antenna pattern, but that pattern is actually a volume. So what we've done is a rotation around the beam center line for this 2-dimensional image, just to show you an estimation graphically of what this volume might look like. It's not perfectly symmetrical, but good enough for our purposes. And it extends much more than plus or minus 10 degrees, by the way. And let's think about what that means. When I've got a radar that is sampling the clear air region with a supercell that has an overhang, and I've got this antenna pattern that is a volume, that means the main lobe is sampling mostly clear air, while the side lobes are sampling the storm itself at multiple elevations. So that is what brings us to elevation side lobe contamination. We use this schematic as a representation for our conceptual model, and a cross-section visualization, also known as the BCS. And no, I'm not talking about football. This is the Boettcher cross-section. What I wanted to do was see what the antenna pattern is seeing. So what we're doing is drawing a cross-section from left to right from the perspective of the radar. So it's perpendicular to the radar viewing angle. And this is what we get for this particular example. Now, this swath is just to show you how broad in azimuth and in height, as well as in multiple elevations, that the returns are. We're still getting returns from the side lobes outside this swath. But down here where the main lobe is sampling clear air, the side lobes are getting power back from all of this stuff aloft. So we coined the phrase elevation side lobe contamination, ESLC. What matters here is that the gradient is not apparent on the low-level images like it is with Azimuthal side lobe contamination. And in the study, Nye et al. That I was a part of, one of the things that I learned is the vast majority of our cases were like this, where there's data that you're seeing but not seeing, which is good news. Noisy velocity, low correlation coefficient, high spectrum width, and otherwise known as junk in the inflow. So how does this happen? I want to take you back to, perhaps some of you have seen cartoons of the Doppler power spectrum. This is a representation of how reflectivity, velocity, and spectrum width get assigned for a given range gate. So the red dotted curve represents the, oh no, what is going on here? Stop. Okay, sorry about that. The red dotted line in the red curve is the main lobe, the return power from the main lobe. The blue curve is the side lobes. Now, these are not to scale. This is highly oversimplified, but it's good enough for our purposes. The point here is, and then the purple curve represents what the data that are actually assigned to that range gate. And the width of this curve is the spectrum width. So the point is that the data that gets assigned is representative of the main lobe instead of the side lobes. That's good. That's what we want. Happens the vast majority of the time. And it's because our main lobes do dominate the side lobes very well, unless there's a strong reflectivity gradient. And then we have the mix that is possible where the return power from the side lobes actually dominates the main lobe sufficiently enough that the spectrum width is actually low and representative of a weather feature. We're going to show you examples of this, but this is an extreme case and it's rare. Most of the cases, I suspect, lie somewhere between this. In other words, there's a mix of main lobe return power, side lobe return power, such that it broadens the spectrum width, makes it higher. And the fact that I've got these from different radial velocity directions is just a function of a reminder that with a supercell, you typically have a radial velocity direction at the lower levels that is opposite from the direction at the mid or upper levels. So this spread is not unexpected with a supercell. And for none of these cases do I have the IQ data to do a signal processing, et cetera. But I strongly suspect that we've got this kind of distribution between the main lobe and side lobe return power for cases where we get this high spectrum width junk in the inflow. Another thing that we discovered, which was very interesting, was that ESLC can actually blend with a three-body scatter spike. So let's take a look. First of all, the hard part's going to be orienting your brain because this storm is to the southeast of our radar this time. So the cross-section technique is left to right from the perspective of the radar, such that we can visualize what the antenna pattern is seeing. And within this three-body scatter spike swath, notice there's something different on the east side compared to the west side, especially with the spectrum width. And there's some differences with the velocity. It doesn't show up quite as well. But the east side of our swath is towards the X in a cross section, and we've got a lot more power from hydrometeors aloft for the side lobes to strike on this side of the three-body scatter spike, which to me is just an item of interest. We are not suggesting that this is something you would be needing to understand during warning operations. The TVSS is more salient with respect to the presence of large hail. So let's get down to what really matters here, ESLC and circulations. You've got an apparent circulation. Is it valid or is it an imposter? Well, the way we're going to help with that is to show you first some examples of coexisting valid and imposter circulations. The first example have them about 6 nautical miles apart. And as Evan showed or discussed very well, you've got to be looking in the right location where the appendage is, the hook. And here's our valid circulation. It's pretty broad, but it's there. Whereas we've got this funky looking thing that's out in the inflow region, and we've got high spectrum width associated with it. And sure enough, our cross-section increases our confidence that this is indeed elevation sidelobe contamination. Here's another example where the two are closer now, about 2 nautical miles apart. Once again, black circle is where the valid circulation is. And look at the texture of the velocity. It looks like it should. And the spectrum of width is also showing us what is typical for a circulation like this. Whereas out in the inflow region, you've got some noisy looking velocity, actually low spectrum width, very low correlation coefficient, and our cross-section increases our confidence that, yep, that's what's going on here. Last example, these are about 2 miles apart, but the inflow region is very small. And the valid circulation, again, is in the blue circle. The imposter's in the yellow circle, but they're really close to one another. You can see the the cross-section here helping us out with our confidence. And by now I know what you're thinking, Jamie. Okay, so what? Well, what matters here is the rotational velocity, as Evan hinted at before, because in this case, the rotational velocity for the valid circulation is 40 knots versus 62 knots for the imposter. And we get it. Your eyes are drawn to the higher velocity values, but be careful here. And my former employer, the Warning Decision Training Division, has guidance that is related to impact-based warnings, such that you could be perhaps assigning a considerable tag where it doesn't belong by looking at an incorrect rotational velocity. This QR code that Evan provided us will take you to this graphic if you'd like. It's also available on WDTD's website. So, diagnostics, what do we do? How do we do this? The first thing that we discovered, and Evan and I walked through this together with multiple storms, but this is a good example, is location. So what I've done is mark off the storm edge from the inflow region. And actually, as we go through this whole thing, I want you to keep in mind that what you're asking yourself is, does it make sense? So first of all, let's look at the texture of the storm relative velocity in the inflow region. Does this make sense as an inbound component of a valid circulation? I'm going to use a very non-scientific term here. This is just a blob of inbound velocities. And you don't see a maxima here at all. So that doesn't make sense. Another thing that doesn't make sense is the extent of the azimuthal shear from inbound to outbound. That doesn't look like Mother Nature to me either. And there is enhanced reflectivity in the inflow region that is almost suggestive of a 3-body scatter spike, right? But the other radar variables don't show us any evidence of a 3-body scatter spike. So what might be going on here? This is a good example, by the way, that the spectrum width is not always high in ESLC. It's remarkably low in this particular case. So even though I don't have IQ data, I strongly suspect that we've got a mix where the side lobe return power is dominating the returns from the main lobe, such that the spectrum width is relatively low. So location, velocity texture, azimuthal shear, spectrum width, all of those things help you out. But I know you want to see the cross-section for this guy, so here we go. Cross-section can increase your confidence in the existence of elevation sidelobe contamination, and in this case, enhancement of reflectivity in the inflow region. One of my engineer colleagues even gave me a thumbs up that that's what's going on here. without the IQ data. Then this is a helpful chart from our paper to summarize these diagnostic steps in an attempt to lower the false alarm rate without, lowering the POD at the same time. So location is number 1 and texture is number 2, with some other things that we discussed. And we suggest that you use the cross-section as a confidence booster. We're not suggesting that a warning forecaster actually be doing the cross-sections. Hopefully you have a partner or somebody else involved that can perhaps do this task. Now I'm going to leave this up for Evan to make more comments about, but also we've got to be super clear about something here, and I'll let Evan take over.
Yeah, so we wanted to kind of talk about what this means, especially for warning forecasters who are trying to utilize this information as part of their warning forecast or warning process. We want to make it very clear. We are not saying that if sidelobe contamination is present, don't issue a tornado warning. That couldn't be further from the truth. Last thing we want is someone, being called in the principal's office after, a day on the warning desk, and they said, why didn't you issue a tornado warning? Well, Jamie and Evan told me not to. That's not what we're saying. This is our disclaimer right now. Because the thing is, this should be used in conjunction with the environment. In this case, we're going to use the significant tornado parameter, STP, as a proxy for that. But let's say in a scenario where you've got the STP is equal to 0. So we've got the star there at the STP 0. To get STP of 0, it requires something very prohibitive for tornadogenesis. Say you've got an elevated storm mode with SINs greater than, I think less than like -150 or something like that. There's multiple ways. I think shear less than like 20 knots or something like that. There's multiple ways to get basically an STP equal to 0, but they're all very prohibitive for tornadoes. So let's say you've got a storm exhibiting sidelobe contamination, your STP is equal to 0. Perhaps in this case, you're able to say, you know what, I'm not going to chase this. I think it's probably sidelobe contamination, and even if it's not, we're in an environment where you wouldn't expect a strong tornado or a long track tornado. It's an environment conducive for if something were to randomly happen. We all know there's random tornadoes that happen all the time that are virtually unforecastable. But if it were to happen, it's not a high end event. Well, let's kind of move up the spectrum there. So let's say you're somewhere here in the middle where it's kind of a run-of-the-mill day, STP 1 or something like that. There's maybe a tornado watch out, but it's not a high-end day. You aren't worried. This isn't a high-risk tornado day, but it's kind of a run-of-the-mill, maybe tornado watch day. Well, then it should be using everything that you see together. If you're like, you know what, I've looked at enough of these events now, I'm confident to say that this is sidelobe contamination. And maybe you're sampling the storm very well, so you can actually see what the real circulation looks like within the hook echo. That's great. Then you're like, you know what, I've got the confidence. I'm going to hold on to this and wait until I see a little better circulation starting to develop back there in the hook. Maybe in storms that aren't as well sampled, or if confidence isn't that high that for sure what you're seeing is sidelobe contamination, maybe it's still a good idea to have a TOR warning out in these scenarios. If you think about it, to get sidelobe contamination, you need strong updraft because you need that echo overhang. Well, if you have a strong updraft and a strong supercell in an environment that's not prohibitive for tornadoes, maybe it's not a bad idea to be like, you know what, there's some questionable velocity data here, but there's enough things that make me say I'm not positive on it, that maybe a tornado warning is still valid there. And if we go up to the high end of the spectrum, high risk tornado day, this should be I would say on days like that, sidelobe contamination should be a minimal thing that you're worried about, because on a day like that, any strong supercell has the potential to produce a strong tornado or even violent tornadoes in a very quick time frame. They can go, like that, they can go from nothing to very strong. And so don't mess around on those days. That's the last thing you should be doing. If you've got a strong, most people kind of operate this way anyway, right? But on those days, if you've got strong supercells on the radar, don't be worried about, oh, it's a sidelobe or not. If it's, those aren't the days to mess around. There's a lot of lives at risk on those days. And it's the other days that really there's some of that nuance. And so kind of wanted to add that component that the environment is part of this process. It's not necessarily part of the identification, but more on how much it matters. At the low end, maybe it matters a lot more, and maybe there's opportunities to decrease false alarm rate on those sides. And other sides of it, it's just, it's not something that we should be interested in doing, in my opinion, from a warning philosophy, because it really doesn't add the value, because the value is really protecting lives and saving lives, and we don't want to ever be not doing that because of sidelobe contamination being present. And that kind of leads into what we're going to talk about next, because it is possible in rare occasions for sidelobe contamination to actually, mask a real circulation at the surface. And Jamie's going to talk about that here coming up. But one other thing that we've learned, and this is a very interesting thing, we've kind of looked at this and had this conversation, and I've gotten a few Twitter DMs and emails from people kind of pointing this out. So our assumption, Jimmy and I both talked about this, and we both kind of assumed that this is true. We're like, all right, well, it's pretty easy when you think there's sidelobe contamination, especially if the spectrum width is low and it's all sidelobe contamination. Oh, just map that velocity. Oh, wait, you got 55 knots. We'll figure out where the 55 knots is aloft, and that's where your sidelobe's coming from, right? The bottom line is no, that doesn't work. We've seen that there's many cases where there's no velocity that matches it aloft. We don't know why it is. And after Jamie spoke with some of our engineering colleagues, they basically said that it's way too complicated for that. It's power weighted. There's so many different, factors being included in here that that's just, it's not that easy. And so that's one thing that I think we both thought we could do. And one thing I think a lot of people do try. If you think of sidelobe contamination, you're trying to figure out what that velocity value is aloft, it's not worth your time. We can't tell you exactly where this velocity is coming from yet. And that's one of the things we want to look at further. But really, it doesn't tell us much of anything at this point. All it tells you is that it clues your eyes into something funky's happening when the velocity doesn't look right and doesn't have the smooth texture you'd expect. It's choppy or whatever. But it doesn't actually tell you anything about what velocities might actually be occurring in that part of the storm.
Okay, those of you that follow me on Twitter, I promised you a myth buster. This is the myth buster that I was talking about. So both Evan and I started out with this premise, and we rarely found the kind of mapping that we thought we'd find everywhere. There are a lot of contributors, but here is one contributor that made me sit up straight when I thought about it. Even at the lowest elevation, and maybe some of you have radars at 0.2 degrees now, there's going to be, unless the storm is really close, there's going to be data below the lowest beam that the side lobes are striking. And as you go further out in range, it might be grabbing more. We don't know. But the point is, these are data we cannot see. And I don't know. I don't even know where to go to explore this any further right now, but if I figure something out, you guys will be the first to know. Okay, as Evan mentioned, one step further is trying to answer this question. Can ESLC actually mask a valid circulation? Joey Pica and I worked on this, and we had this as our showcase for this past annual meeting. We're going to use the deep layer shear vector as a proxy for the degree of storm tilt for a supercell. So here is our contour at the lowest elevation, and here is our contour aloft, just representing the overhang that is with this supercell. And our area of interest is right here on the tip of the hook, because this is where we are most likely going to have a valid circulation, either exist or form. Okay. Let's bring in the radar orientation with respect to this supercell. And in this case, we've got two radars looking at this storm, and what matters here is that the radial is roughly parallel to this deep layer shear vector. Okay, so what? What happens when you apply the Boettcher cross section? From either one of the radars. Remember, it's perpendicular to the radar. Well, look at what we're grabbing with this cross section. We are not capturing very much of the overhang. This is going to decrease the amount of sidelobe contamination that can interfere with this sweet spot for a valid circulation. On the other hand, same shear vector, same storm. This time we've got radar radials that happen to be nearly perpendicular to this shear vector. So what happens when you draw the cross section? Now we're capturing more of this overhang, and this increases the chance of having sidelobe contamination interfering with a valid circulation. All right, let's look at some data real quick. This is a supercell to the south of the radar, and our deep shear vector is in the white arrow here. And from this perspective of the storm, it's fairly close to being perpendicular. When we draw the cross section through the tip of the hook, we've got pretty robust reflectivity aloft for the side lobes to strike. Now, same storm, same original radar, but what would happen if this storm was viewed from a radar to the east? So again, I'm drawing right, my radar radial is going right into the hook, and I'm drawing my cross section along the hook. And we don't have nearly as much aloft. So this is the case where the deep shear vector is mostly parallel to the radar radial. And finally, what would happen if this same storm was examined by our radar to the northwest? So our radar radial again and our shear vector are close to perpendicular. And this time when we draw the cross section, oh my goodness, we've got a very stout overhang here for the side lobes to strike. So if you take this same storm, I think what about 20 minutes later, and we are southeast of the radar now. So we have this radar radial that is close to perpendicular to the shear vector. And we've marked off the inflow region. Let's look at what's going on here. Got a lot of noisy velocity data, low correlation, mostly high spectrum width, enhanced reflectivity. Sounding familiar, everybody? When we draw the cross section at this time step, and we're mostly perpendicular to the radar radial, again, we've got a very stout overhang for the side lobes to be striking. So high confidence that we've got elevation side lobe contamination going on here. This is at 211. 2 minutes later, I want you to look at what pops out in that inflow region. We've got a blob, very small blob, of inbound velocity that appears to be valid. And one of the things that increases our confidence is that the spectrum width is low with this guy. So the discussion that I've just given you about both of these radar images and supporting the validity of this pop-up is, again, sense-making. It's a very powerful tool that you use whether you know it or not. All right, there's more coming on all of that, but for now, Evan and I thank you for your time, and we would be welcome to have any questions.
First off, if anybody would like to share their stories about how side lobe contamination impacted your decisions or just radar analysis in general, raise your hand and I will be happy to unmute you.
Yeah, thank you, Becca. Every one of us has been fooled by this.
I know I have. In my previous warning days, yeah, I can definitely think of one or two instances where I got really excited about, you know, a velocity, an inbound velocity signature or whatnot, and oh, I gotta keep a really close eye on this, and then it would go away, or it, you know, it ended up being just junk in the inflow, and so yeah, uh-oh, my dog's barking. So yeah, okay, go ahead and share your.
Anybody willing to share with us your adventures?
And I can break the ice too, because it's interesting to see the value that this research adds. Because, you know, let's take a place here like the SPC. We've got guys and gals here who have been looking at radar data for, I mean, decades, and you know, in a given year, anyone working forecast desk probably looks at 10 to 20,000 radar images per year, I would guess, minimum, just as part of your operational duties. And even with that, there's been times since we've done this work that I've seen a circulation and just having a quick glance, because once you look at it a long time, it sounds daunting, but when you actually have done it once you start knowing what you're looking for, you can recognize it without doing a cross section, without even looking aloft. You can just look at it and be like, something doesn't look right. It's the sense-making thing, right? You're like, something doesn't look right. That's probably sidelobe contamination. I've had that now where I'll be like, yeah, don't worry about that. That's just sidelobe. I was like, it looks scarier than it is. And I've had other people, who've been working here for 20 years who are like, really? They're like, that looks pretty good to me. Come show me what you're looking at. So, it's not something that's been documented that well. And so, if you have been, caught by it or whatever, don't feel bad. I mean, it's happening to, the best, some of the best and brightest in the industry have seen a lot of radar signatures, because it's a challenging problem and something that we're hoping to kind of expand the knowledge base on, because it is such an important issue.
All right, go ahead, James. You are unmuted.
Hey,
like to share.
Jamie and Evan, great work. This is fascinating stuff, since Steve Piltz infected me with the awareness of this way too long ago. There's a psychological factor also at play while we're analyzing for these things, and that is the noise that we're getting from not only outside the TV station where I am, but outside warning desks, of the noise not only occasionally in chat, but also from armchair meteorologists screaming, why is there no warning? And to say that that is not a legitimate effect, I think is not necessarily true, because nobody wants to be second guessed on a warning decision, even if you're making it for the right reason. And that is can be an enormous distraction while you're weeding through this.
Yeah, I'll build on that and say the challenging problem with that is you can be right 19 out of 20 times, but that 1 out of 20 times that a fluky tornado would occur when you've downplayed an event, for reasons that are not scientific, you could lose your entire credibility with a certain part of the audience, which is asinine from a scientific perspective. But from a reality perspective, it's a big problem, right?
Yeah, 100%. And again, just because you have, and you all made this point, just because you have sidelobe contamination does not mean that you can't have a tornado. It's very diagnostic that you've got a supercell brewing.
I do hope that doing this talk through the NWA can be helpful to the entire weather enterprise also.
Thank you for your story. We'll hear one more from Ryan Sharp. Go ahead, you are unmuted.
Hey, yeah, thanks for this talk. This is going to be a really good reference for later on to look at some of these images and to go back through some of the papers you guys have done. The story I remember, actually Dan McKeamy was one of our better radar warning forecasters here at the office. And he got a call from Pat Spoden about a supercell that was moving into our CWA from Paducah's area. And he said, I think this is sidelobe contamination. You guys just be careful about issuing any warnings on this one. And it turned out he was right. And we had that armchair quarterbacking going on as these cells were moving into our Bowling Green, Kentucky area. This was back in 2020. And a lot of people were telling us, why don't they have a warning out? And we were right. It was one of those cases where the forecaster made a good decision on the warning desk. That just popped into my head when you guys were talking about war stories.
Awesome, thanks for sharing. We do have a couple questions. First one, what are side lobes like around a TDWR beam? Is it similar to WSR 88Ds?
Ooh, no. First of all, it's a different frequency. So I don't know the side lobe levels for TDWR. So I don't have a quick answer for that. I'd have to look it up. But the frequency difference is a factor, as well as the beam shaping that is a function of the size of the dish. So great question. I wish I could answer it for you.
Future research, it sounds like.
There you go. Well, you know me, I get a question and then I gotta know the answer to it.
Uh-huh. So how do applications, say, like MRMS, which is the multi-radar, multi-sensor product, how does that software handle sidelobe contaminations in its analysis? Do you have any thoughts on that?
No.
I can speak to that. I can speak to that somewhat. It's going to suffer the same problems that we see in the data because it's simply an algorithmic effect. However, it's not that big of a deal from an MRMS perspective because MRMS oftentimes very long track, strong supercells are going to show a strong signal from MRMS anyway because the multi-radar component, you actually have a deeper mesocyclone that's being measured by it. And so, it's actually the utility of MRMS actually makes it so that sidelobe contamination isn't a huge deal for it because you aren't using sidelobe contamination to figure out what a VROT value is, for example. All it's really telling you is there's a rotating storm in this area. And if there's sidelobe, a lot of times there's a rotating storm. And so it might change the exact values as far as, how strong, like, is it actually as strong as it says? But as far as most of the utilities kind of just pointing out where a rotating storm might be. And so from that aspect, it's not going to have a huge impact because the storm likely is still rotating anyway at a similar strength to what the sidelobe might be showing. It just might not be at a 1/2 degree.
All right, thanks for that answer. Next question. Can mesosales like VCP can help with better diagnosis of sidelobe contamination?
Yes, I'll take that one. In fact, the example that I showed you towards the end there, where we had the little pop out with the, the more frequently you can sample the data, the more continuity you're going to have with this artifact, at least I believe. Of course, you pay the price because of the slower update rates aloft. At any rate, the one thing I wish I had said on that last slide with the little pop-ups, see if he's here. Yes. Oh my God. See, this is a 2-minute gap, and they had sales times 2 or 3. I really don't remember, but I would love to see 30-second updates at least between 211 and 213 to get the subtleties for the pop out of this velocity value. So we never get data fast enough.
Well, and one other thing I've seen that I think helps is that, if let's say you see something and you're like, wow, it looks like it's got strong circulation. I think that's probably sidelobe circulation. In the past, you might have had to wait 5-6 minutes for the next scan to come in. And if it's entering a population center, for example, and you're not sure that it's sidelobe, you might have to be like, you know what, I don't care if it's, I just got to pull the trigger on this. Whereas with 1 to 2 minute updates, you can be like, all right, well, let's see what the next scan says. Oh, okay, good, it went away. All right, that's what I thought. It was an artifact. Whereas because there are times, and when we look through this, there are times when you've got a supercell that sidelobes in almost a steady state for an hour or two, especially when it's moving directly towards the radar. So your radar beam's hitting it at like the same angle for a long period of time, and it's kind of steady state supercell. But that is a little more rare. Actually, a lot of times you are going to see a lot more jumps in the velocity values and the locations, et cetera, when it's sidelobe versus a real circulation. And so the more frequent updates to that does help your brain kind of say, all right, that looks weird. Why is it jumping around like that? That can be another sign to help you out when you're looking at things.
Very interesting. James has a comment here as a caution for broadcast meteorologists. The shear and rotation products generated for TV broadcasters do not filter ESLC out. He said those products are corrupted too, in addition to the NROT on GR2 analyst. Is that Earth, GR2AE? I'm guessing. I haven't used GR2 Earth before, so I'm not sure. Yes, thank you. All right, so another question here. Has there been any research on whether any type of environments cause these signatures more? You talked about the shear vectors, but do thermodynamics play any part? Or is it just something that can happen with any strong updraft? Good question.
Jamie, you want me to start, and you can think on it for a second. I'll say initially thermodynamically tropical environments where you've got less size sorting of hail versus you got less hail in the column, et cetera. You tend to see less side lobe contamination because you've got just less. When you've got 70 dBz aloft, the side lobes return a lot more power than when you've got 50, 55 dBz aloft. Would kind of be the point there. And in tropical environments, you're going to have that. That's initially kind of the main thermodynamic reason I could think of. Jamie, can you think of anything else kind of building on that?
No, actually, this is a great example of the way Jamie thinks and the way Evan thinks and why this work has been so successful. Because I'm immediately thinking, wait, no, it's all about the antenna pattern and the distribution of hydrometeors. And so I guess with respect to environment, yeah, the more highly reflective hydrometeors you can loft for the side lobes to strike, the better. But I don't know how to express that in terms of the environment.
That's why we're a match made in heaven.
I know.
All right, let's see. One more and then we'll close out. So is it possible to automate detection and filtering of side lobe contamination signatures?
Oh boy. Steve Piltz actually made 2 or 3 years ago now a pitch for funding, and he had a proposal for a way to put an algorithm in the RPG that could at least identify possible elevation side lobe contamination, not remove it. I've talked to my engineer pals, pestered them whenever I can about, is there any way to be able to filter this out at the signal processing level? And thus far, the answer has been no. But as we move forward into phased array and the capability of having advanced beamforming techniques, I will keep pestering them about that because of the ability to do things that you may not be able to do. But with respect to the 88D network, it would be possible to, with funding and support, perhaps put something into the RPG that can at least identify areas of suspect elevation side lobe contamination because of the characteristics that I've shown you with respect to the velocity spectrum width correlation coefficient.
All right. Well, thank you, Jamie and Evan, for an amazing presentation today. Kudos to both of you for and your colleagues for working on this topic. And I think it will be extremely useful in anyone's warning operation and operational warning environment, whether it's National Weather Service or private sector, TV broadcasters. I think this will be a very valuable tool. One other tool to in your toolbox to use, as James also commented on. To help us and meteorologists, have a more complete radar analysis and hopefully be able to make a more informed decision on particular supercell or storm itself on how dangerous that actually could be and how it could impact the people in its path. So I thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody in the audience for joining in and participating and listening to the webinar. That's all we have for now. Stay tuned to the National Weather Association's social media accounts for updates on the next webinar. Thanks again. See you soon.
Thank you, Becca.